Welcome to the International School of Tailoring. My name is Reza and this is your 8th lesson of our How to Make a Bespoke Jacket series. In the previous lesson, we learned about construction lines and their relation to the weave of the fabric. So now that we know about weave and construction lines, it's time to learn the fundamentals of striking out. Now, if we look at our connection map, we'll see that striking out as a subject, let's say, is connected to at least 4 other elements within the tailoring domain. The first one is construction, and by that I mean the construction of the garment. The second one is construction lines. The third one, warp and weft, and last but not least, fittings. The way it's connected to construction of the garment is that sometimes we lay our patterns on the fabric in a way that an area falls on the bias or the straight grain. These two have different properties and they will affect the construction of the garment. If it's on the bias, it may have to be reinforced with a straight tape, for example. Construction lines are of course important when we are striking out because it's the construction lines that we match to the next element, which is the warp and the weft. So therefore we have to identify the warp and the weft of the fabric to match our construction lines with. And last but not least, we have fittings, and fittings require changes. Changes require the additional material that we trace around our pattern, which we call inlay. So why do we need a whole video about the theory of striking out? Well, it's very simple if you ask me. Instead of showing you one particular lay of laying your patterns on your fabric and then cutting them out, I would like you to learn the principles so that you can do whatever you want. Now, there are going to be 5 factors that you need to keep in mind to lay, trace, and cut out your fabric from your pattern. If you know these 5 factors, you will be able to prevent and solve unexpected problems. So, this is what we're going to do. I will first tell you about the 5 factors, and then I'm going to give you some details about each one of them. If you're ready, let's go. Now, anytime you're striking out your pattern on your fabric, there are going to be 5 universal factors that you have to keep in mind. What are those factors? Well, the first factor is going to be pile. Does your fabric have hairs on it like a cashmere, or is it just a plain weave fabric? Then we have factor number 2, and that's going to be the grain of the fabric. After that, we have factor number 3, and that's going to be the inlays, and we as tailors are going to make alterations, so we need extra fabric for those alterations. Then we have factor number 4, and that's going to be fit up, and this is going to be the extra fabric that we need to make the pockets, the collars, and things like that. And then the last factor, factor number 5, is going to be design. Is your fabric a stripe, a check, or a plain? So let's begin with the first factor called pile. Let's say you've got your patterns and you're ready to strike them out. The first thing that you have to establish is whether your fabric has a pile or not. A pile is simply the long fibers or hairs that lay in one direction of your fabric. The way to find out what the direction of the pile is, or whether your fabric has a pile in the first place, is to open up your fabric so that you can see the right side. Then you will make a downwards brushing movement. If nothing happens, brush upwards, and if the fibers or the hairs stand up and the fabric becomes darker, that means you're dealing with a fabric with a pile. On a real fabric with a pile, like this corduroy, this is how it looks. We brush down, nothing happens. But when we brush up, we see that the fabric becomes darker and the fibers stand up. So we will have to mark the resting position of the piles, the natural position, on our fabric. And we do that on multiple areas to make sure we don't forget at any stage of the lay that we are dealing with a fabric with a pile. Now, the general rule is that the garment should be cut so that the pile runs from the top to the bottom. So all these panels should be laid so that the pile runs from the top of the panel to the bottom. This means that we can't flip our panels upside down because one will have the pile running from the bottom to the top and the rest will have the pile run from the top to the bottom. You can, however, flip the panels on their own vertical axes, because that will still allow you to run the pile from the top to the bottom. Now, why should the pile always be from the top to the bottom? Well, first of all, we always have gravity pulling things downward. But another reason for that is that anytime you move in your garment, your natural resting position should always brush the pile downwards to its natural direction. So if we look at this forepart and we have our sleeves, anytime we move our arms upwards, we are brushing against the pile, so the fibers will stand up. But at some point we'll have to lower our arm, and so anytime we lower our arm, we are brushing the pile back to its natural position. The same thing happens for trousers when you're standing up or sitting down. Now, let's say you've got all of this sorted and you're ready to mark. Please make sure that anytime you mark your panels, you also mark the direction of the pile inside your chalk lines, especially if you're marking squares and rectangles for your fit up, because it's very easy to forget that you're dealing with a fabric with a pile and what the direction was. You can imagine that if you cut out these squares and you lay them on your board and you work on something else in between, picking this up again can result in a faulty flap or a mistake whereby the pockets are having the pile running upwards while everything else is downwards. So always remind yourself of the pile and its direction. Now, of course, if you know these rules, you can also break them. So if you have a project whereby you have to cut everything so that the pile runs from the bottom to the top, feel free to do so, as long as you do it consciously and not by accident. So keep everything consistent. That's all you need to know about piles. So once you've established whether your fabric has a pile or not, it's time to identify the grain. And by grain, I simply mean the warp and the weft, the vertical grain and the horizontal grain. The general rule for laying your jacket is so that the horizontal grain matches the chest line of your jacket. So the weft is always parallel to the chest line. Sometimes on some fabrics like flannels, it's very difficult to see the individual yarns. It's very difficult to see the grain. In those cases, you will use your selvage as a reference. What you will do is you will take your L square and align one end with the selvage and draw a perpendicular line to act as your guide for the weft. This will allow you to position your panel and match the chest line with that line, or even if you have to go higher or lower, you at least have a horizontal line to make sure that your chest line runs parallel. Please, please, please don't just randomly try to match the other outer edges of your panels with some of the grains, because that will have serious consequences. And let me just draw on the board for you what that could look like. If we go back to our lesson on construction lines, we will remember our mannequin, and our mannequin had a red horizontal line wrapped around its chest. And this horizontal line was parallel to the floor. And the same thing was also the case if we looked at our mannequin from the side. We would have our horizontal stripe around the chest, and that would be parallel to the floor. This is our chest construction line, and at the same time the weft of the fabric. If we manage to get this right on the jacket, this is roughly how our jacket will look like. We will have our jacket and the lapels and horizontal stripes going through the forepart, and all of those are going to be parallel to the floor. And the vertical stripes are going to be perpendicular, nice and neat, going from the top to the bottom. But maybe you come up with a genius idea of matching the stripe to the angle of your front edge so that you have one full stripe going through it. If you do that, you, depending on the angle of your front edge, may end up with something like this. A nice and neat matching vertical stripes to the edge of your front edge, but at the same time having all the vertical lines of your fabric going diagonally. And if they go diagonally, well, so will your horizontal stripes. Now you could still use your balance lines to make sure that you match all the panels correctly, but the pattern on the panel itself is going to be completely skewed. Now this becomes really problematic when we're trying to match the checks of the front panel to the sleeves all the way to the back panel. So imagine we have a beautiful jacket and we have the sleeve, but we have ignored the construction lines, and now we have the stripes of our front panel go in one direction and the stripes of our back panel go in the other direction. Everything is a mess, and of course with weird vertical stripes come weird horizontal stripes. So the horizontal stripes of our front panel are going in the downwards direction and on the back on an upwards direction. So what do? Well, you can ignore the back completely and just match the sleeve to the front checks, let's say, to the front horizontal stripes, but you won't really have a nice match at the back. Or you can really make an effort and match these two together, but then you have a zigzag party going on. So it's not really ideal. Now you may say, well, this is what happens on a check. On a stripe or a plain fabric, it wouldn't be that visible if we change the angle a little bit. Well, let me show you how that is still visible on a stripe or a plain fabric. So here we have a sleeve, let's say, and that sleeve has a bend from the elbow. And the correct orientation of that sleeve, this is the rest of the jacket, for example, the correct orientation is like this. We have the sleeve cut so that when you place this on the straight grain, this is how the shape of the sleeve goes on top of the straight grain. However, this produces an almost diagonal rectangle on our fabric, and that has a lot of negative space that can go to waste when we are cutting our sleeves out. So we say, let's save some fabric and change the direction or the rotation of the sleeve on our pattern. So when you have your striped fabric, instead of laying the sleeve like so and have the horizontal line be perpendicular to the vertical line, you save some space and match the forearm seam to the stripe. So you rotate the sleeve a little bit so that you can get the sleeve to match one full stripe. But by doing that, you have changed the orientation of the sleeve. Now you can still put the same sleeve into the jacket, but the orientation is actually skewed now. So by the time this goes into the armhole, and let's say here we have the jacket receiving that sleeve, this will rotate forwards, go to the pitch that it's intended to, but now this red line is actually to the original place where it had to be, but because we have matched the full stripe with the forearm, the grain is moving forwards and is not really perpendicular to our chest line. And if the rest of your garment is cut correctly, then boy, do you have a mismatch. Now you see this often on many sleeves. And one of the reasons this happens on a lot of sleeves is that when tailors are cutting the garment and they're fitting it, after a few fittings, the pitch is not matching the body anymore. So they have to match the sleeve pitch to the pitch of the person. So what do? They just rotate the sleeves forwards or backwards, depending on where they are at. And what happens is that the front checks may match, but the back checks don't match, or at the same time, even worse, the front grain of the sleeve is going forwards and the rest of the jacket is just falling down. So these are the ways that disrespecting the construction lines can go wrong. So keep that in mind. So let's say you've positioned your patterns so that the chest line is matching the weft of the fabric. Before you go ahead and mark everything out, make sure that you've distanced the patterns correctly from one another. The reason why this is important is that we're going to add something called inlay. Inlay is simply the extra fabric that we leave around our panels to make alterations possible. So let's say we have marked our back here. What we have to do is, according to the alterations that we are anticipating, we will leave some extra fabric around this pattern so that we can make all the changes that we need to it. Every panel and every garment requires a different amount of inlay. I will give you all the full details in the next lesson along with the PDF for your reference, but the main point that I would like to highlight is that the way you lay your patterns is partially determined by how much distance you need to have between them due to the inlay. So once you've determined how much inlay you need around each one of your panels, the next thing to focus on is going to be your fit up. Fit up is simply the extra fabric that you need to make all the different components of your jacket. The 5 most important fit ups are your facing, your top collar, the flaps and the jettings for your cross pocket, and your out breast welt. If you don't have flaps and jettings as your pocket, then that is replaced with a patch pocket, if there are going to be any pockets around the hip area. Now, I'm not telling you to lay and draw out your fit up just as I have done. This is just to illustrate what the most important pieces of fit up are. And of course, every garment will require a different amount or a different size or a different shape of fit up. Some jackets will have a cuff or a self undercollar. In those cases, you have to consider those as well. But the general idea is to have a facing, a top collar, your pockets, whether flaps, jettings or a patch, and your out breast welt. The last factor to consider is going to be the design of the fabric. And by design, I simply mean whether the fabric has a stripe or a check. Now, the way to cut checks and stripes is like the following. You will lay your patterns according to all the principles that I described. And then once you've marked out one of your patterns, you will remove the pattern, only cut the top layer, then match that top layer with the fabric underneath it so that the stripes and the checks match perfectly, then pin around so that nothing moves, and then cut around the edges. You will proceed by doing exactly the same for all the different panels. This way, you minimize the risk of having 2 panels with a different orientation on the stripe or the check. So, to summarize today's lesson, there are 5 factors that you have to consider when striking out a garment. Factor number 1 is going to be the pile. Always run the pile from the top to the bottom of the garment. Factor number 2 is going to be the grain. Match the chest line to the weft of the fabric. Factor number 3 is going to be the inlays. No matter how much inlay you need, there is always going to be some. Factor number 4 is going to be the fit up. The most important pieces of fit up that you need are going to be the facing, the top collar, the out breast welt, either your flaps or your jettings, or your patch pocket. And the last factor is going to be the design. If it's a stripe or a check, cut one layer at a time. The first one, then match it to the second one, and then cut the second one. Now, as long as you follow these rules, you can be sure of the fact that you're striking out correctly, no matter how you're laying your patterns. If this video brought value to you, you can help us by sharing this video or with a small donation. We're making serious efforts to bring tailoring to the entire world and making it as accessible as possible. Thank you very much. My name is Reza. This was today's lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.